Good morning, or at least it's morning for me. I have no idea what's going on with you right now, but yeah. So chapter 8 is all about reproduction. There's a lot of really interesting things in this chapter. So I'm kind of excited to talk about all this stuff because I think it's really interesting. Um, but ultimately, when you talk about evolution, this should have been emphasized to you throughout the course, and I believe it has been emphasized to you throughout the course. It all comes down to reproduction. Um, it doesn't matter how long you live, as long if there's no reproduction, then evolution doesn't really care about you. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. When we talk about reproduction, we're going to spend most of our time talking about sexual reproduction, but it is important to keep in mind that asexual reproduction is a thing, and a lot of organisms do go through asexual reproduction. Actually, it's likely that more animals go through asexual reproduction than go through sexual reproduction. And also asexual reproduction is common in vertebrates as well. We've already talked about the New Mexican whiptail lizard that reproduces asexually. Turkeys are capable of reproducing asexually, so are sharks, and there's a decent amount of vertebrates that are capable of reproducing asexually, but it's not the norm. Sexual reproduction is the norm, at least in vertebrates. It probably across the animal kingdom, I would say, well, because insects, I would guess sexual reproduction is probably the most common. Regardless of what's the most common, it does seem like sexual reproduction has an advantage, right? And a simple thought experiment will get you to this conclusion. My cat is about to jump on the counter, and I'm going to have to yell at her, so just be aware of that. Sassy. Um, Asexual reproduction, if you undergo asexual reproduction, you pass 100% of your DNA on, right? But if you use sexual reproduction, you only pass on 50% of your DNA. So the decreased amount of DNA that you're passing on it acts almost as a cost, right? So if sexual reproduction exists, it must have some advantages, right? So what are those advantages? The first thing I'd like to point out is that it's not always advantageous. There are some situations where it is advantageous and some situations where it is not advantageous. The next slide, yeah, right here. So this is there's a group of organisms known as Daphnia. Daphnia magna is probably the most well studied. I think they're insects of some kind, but they have the capability of reproducing sexually and asexually, which is unique. And so scientists have studied these little noble water fleas. Oh, females can reproduce asexually, males cannot, if I remember correctly. And they looked at when they undergo sexual reproduction and when they go through asexual reproduction. And as it turns out, when conditions are really good and stable, it's better to go through asexual reproduction because it's less energy expensive. And like I said, you're passing on 100% of your DNA. So they can increase the population really rapidly by asexually reproducing. When times are variable, it's actually better to go through sexual reproduction because you don't know what the ecosystem is going to be like next. So you want to have more varied offspring. So the ability to produce more varied offspring via sexual reproduction is probably the biggest advantage of it. Yeah. So another advantage of sexual reproduction is chromatin repair. So a simple thought experiment, if you think about an asexually reproducing organism, if there is a mutation somewhere in that organism and it goes through either cell division or asexual reproduction, then all the subsequent daughter cells will have that mutation as well, and it won't take long for a lot of mutations to develop. When you're undergoing sexual reproduction, because of mitosis, meiosis, all that different stuff, it provides a second template of DNA for which you to cross over and exchange DNA with, and also just like a second set of DNA. So if you have mutations on, say, chromosomes A and C, and your partner does on chromosomes B and D, and then you undergo sexual reproduction, some of your individual offspring may have all of those mutations, but they'll be selected out of the population, and some of your offspring will have none of those mutations. And then, so that gives it an opportunity to produce individuals who have none of those mutations. If they actually do confer a fitness disadvantage, then they're removed from the population. But if they confer a fitness advantage, then they're selected for. So like sexual reproduction produces more combinations for natural selection to select from, basically. The last advantage of sexual reproduction is that there's at least some evidence that it helps with immunity. Parasites seem to be one of the greatest threats to any individual organism. Just by successfully weakening them, you make them more vulnerable to other predators and so on and so forth. Humans and a lot of other animals have these compounds called MHC class 2. They're major histocompatibility proteins. And basically, there's different variations of them. And if you, by reproducing with individuals who have different types of MHC class 2, you produce offspring that have more varied MHC class 2 profiles, which makes them more resistant to parasites. This is one of the reasons why inbreeding is very bad, is because you all have the same MHC class 2 molecules and you just become susceptible to parasites. There is some evidence that females will actually select individuals with different MHC class 2 proteins. This was all the rage when I was in graduate school, and everybody was testing all the animals to see which ones did in fact show selection for MHC class 2 and which ones did not. And there's some really interesting research out there. This also kind of like swept into the popular culture in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, wherein there's evidence in humans, weak evidence, but there's evidence in humans that females will select males with different MHC class 2 proteins. And so what people would do, and males too, it actually works the other way around. But what people would do was they'd sleep in a t-shirt for like 7 days without any deodorant, cologne, or anything like that. And then they would put it in a bag, and then everybody would smell each other's t-shirt. And if it smelled really bad to you, you probably have the same MHC class 2s. If they smell different, then you have different MHC class 2s. And like that was how people were finding dates in the early 2000s. Give us a break. It was before Tinder was invented. I never took part in one, just to be very clear. It might just be an urban legend for all I know, but it's a fairly silly example of pop culture just doing silly stuff because of a science article. And to be perfectly honest, if smelling someone's t-shirt is what helps you find love, I guess more power to you. I'm not going to judge you. But that is probably one of the weirder things that happened in the early 2000s. Again, I never took part in one. Just want to be very clear about that. So one of the interesting things is that the human egg is 100 or 10 million times larger than the sperm. The egg is the largest cell in the human body. It's actually visible with the naked eye. And the sperm is the smallest cell in the human body. And so you have to wonder why. Why is the egg so much bigger than the sperm? There's also interesting consequences that come from this just from like a investment point of view, but we will talk about that later. And so scientists have been wondering this for a while too, like why? And so one of the leading theories is that it reduces self-fertilization. If one gamete is really big and one gamete is really small, then the two really big gametes can't fuse to form a new offspring, and the small ones definitely can't, right? And self-fertilization isn't unheard of. It's rare in animals, but it's somewhat common in plants. Don't ask me about fungi. I'll get to that in a minute. So there seems to be some selection against it, and it probably is similar selective pressures to like what's going on with incest. If you self-fertilize, you're really just kind of losing all the advantages of sexual reproduction. So I can see why there would be a drive to reduce that, and so that could be the explanation. Um, Fungi have this really, really weird life cycle wherein they are only diploid during sexual reproduction. Otherwise, they're haploid for the vast majority of their life. So you can see the blue is where they're, or actually it's just the orange. Heterokaryotic is after fusion of two different fungi. They like fuse the cytoplasm, and then they go through some type of process and they become diploid, and then they immediately produce spores that are haploid, and those haploid spores then produce, the fungi we see, yeast and stuff like that. And then they can go through an asexual phase. So they only sexually reproduce when they run into other fungi. I will tell you, fungi are really, really weird. I remember learning about this and just thinking, what the fuck? Fungi are probably super important by biomass. That could be one of the largest kingdoms in life, and we really don't know a whole lot about them. Yeah, fungi are really interesting. This is a funny meme I found. Just enjoy it. Another possible explanation for the different size of gametes is it could have to do with mitochondria. There is some evidence that mitochondria don't really like each other. And if you have two different types of mitochondria in you, they will actually go to war with each other, and that's not good for your cells, and so that is a problem. So if the mother is the only one passing on the mitochondria, then it reduces that pressure, right? Like you only have one type of mitochondria. Interestingly enough, there is a condition where a woman does not have functioning mitochondria, or she has a mitochondrial disease or something like that. And so there was a while ago, there was a scientist produced a baby that had three parents, quote unquote. And so what they did was they took the mother, right, the mother's egg, implanted into a donor's, took the nucleus out of it and put it into a donor's healthy egg, right, and then fertilized it with the father and then re-imported it back into the mother. And so this individual is getting 49.9% of the DNA from the quote-unquote mother, the one who carried the baby, and the other 49.9% from the father in terms of the sperm, but the mitochondrial information is actually coming from the donor egg. So technically they did have three parents, but that's how that worked. It's kind of an interesting aside. One moment. Sorry, I just had to get some water. So sex determination, there's a lot of different kinds of sex determination systems out there, but I'm going to go through some of the biggest ones. So XXXYs, which you're most familiar with. It's common in mammals. Some lizards go through XXXY. My study organism did. Some insects, some fish, and apparently ginkgos, the tree. So the interesting thing about XXXY is that it's the SRY region, the sex determining region of the Y chromosome, is what actually does it. And so the typical situation is the XX female and the XY male, but it is possible to get an XX male if there's a translocation of the SRY gene to the X chromosome, or if there's a mutation to the XY chromosome or to the Y chromosome, the SRY gene, then you'll get an XY female. And these are actually more common than you think they would be. So when people are like, oh, female is XX and male is XY, yeah, usually, but not always. So just keep that in mind. There's also interesting things that happen where you have individuals with 3 X chromosomes. Some individuals have an X chromosome and then 2 Ys. Some people have an X and no Y chromosome, like they only have 1 sex chromosome at all. So there's some interesting things going on with that. The other thing about it is that because females have 2 X chromosomes and males have 1 X chromosome, either males have to double their expression of the X chromosome or females have to half their expression of genes on the X chromosome. And as it turns out, females express half as much of their X chromosomes. So they go through this process known as X inactivation. where one of the X chromosomes is shut down at a certain developmental stage. And what's interesting about this is they don't pick like either the maternal or the paternal is shut off. Like each individual cell at that developmental stage just picks a random X chromosome to shut off. So some will be expressing the paternal X chromosome, and some will be expressing the maternal X chromosome. And so females are actually a mosaic of X chromosomes. Like part of a female's body is expressing the paternal, and part of the female's body is expressing the maternal, which is really interesting. As a last bit of an aside, this is super visible in tortoiseshell cats. So tortoiseshell cats, as it turns out, the control for black versus orange pigmentation it's X-linked, right? Which is why most orange cats are male, although you can have orange female cats, right? Anyway, what happens with tortoiseshells is they shut off half the maternal and half the paternal. So if you have a black cat and an orange cat that have a baby, they have a tendency to produce tortoiseshell cats that have that black and orange pigmentation. To get a calico, there's a third gene that actually stops the expression of that orange-black phenotype, and so then that just produces white. And that's called, I can't remember what that's called, but that's basically how you get tortoiseshells and calicos, and that's why tortoiseshells and calicos are almost always female, is because you have to have the XY chromosomes. Just kind of cool. ZW is probably the next most common system that you run across. Birds, some reptiles, and a few other species do it. It's a lot like XXXY, except males are homozygous and females are heterozygous. This is the only real difference. Temperature dependent is really interesting. A lot of people know about temperature independent, and it's basically based upon at different temperatures, different enzymes are activated. Some of those enzymes lead to a male-specific characteristic, some lead to female-specific characteristic, and like the enzymes are different for different species, right? So this is common in reptiles and some fish. The most interesting thing to me about this is with global warming, I'm wondering if that will alter the sex ratio of some organisms. But the other interesting thing about it is it actually allows organisms to choose, at least to a certain degree, what sex they want their offspring to be. Like if a female wanted to have a bunch of female babies, she would just bury it in a cooler location or a warmer location, depending upon the specifics, right? Sequential hermaphrodism is really common amongst fish. And basically what happens is, so it can either be male to female sequential hermaphrodism or female to male. And so basically what happens is there's kind of this school type situation where you have a group of fishes living together, and the largest individual will be male, right? And they secrete a hormone that stops all the other individuals from developing male characteristics, and they're the only male, right? And then when that individual dies, the next largest individual will become a male. It works in the opposite direction as well, like the largest individual could be the female. So in the clownfish, the largest individual is the female, and the next largest, and all the rest of them are males. The most interesting thing about this is that in Finding Nemo, what would have happened when Nemo's mom died is that Nemo's dad would have turned into a female. And that's what should have happened, but obviously isn't what happened. Fencing is a really, really strange one, but it's really kind of interesting. And so basically what happens is all flatworms are hermaphroditic, but there's more costs associated with being the quote-unquote female. And so they try not to be the female, so it results in this characteristic called penis fencing, wherein the two flatworms try to stab each other, and the first one that gets stabbed becomes the female. It's a really, really strange reproductive system, but it's kind of interesting. And then we also talked about haplodiploidy. It's most common amongst insects of the group Hymenoptera, which is bees and ants. Basically what happens is males are haploid and females are diploid. And so that creates that weird situation wherein females are more closely related to each other than they are to female siblings are more closely related to each other than they would be to their own offspring. Yeah. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about behavioral ecology stuff. Um, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but there's some weird baggage with behavioral ecology that we'll talk about. Um, but when you're talking about reproductive strategies, it's really all about investment, right? And so when you're comparing investment on an interspecific scale, you end up with this R versus K strategy spectrum, wherein some organisms put very little energy into their offspring, but make many of them and hope they survive. And then on the other extreme, they put a lot of investment in and hope that just those few survive. So R versus K strategies would be like the interspecific investment strategy, like how much energy do individuals put into their own offspring survival. And so, that is a broad continuum that exists in this world. Also look at how different organisms utilize different mating systems, right? And there's basically four different mating systems that come up. The first of which is promiscuity. And promiscuity, when we use the phrase promiscuous, it usually means someone who sleeps around. And that's not really what we mean in the animal kingdom. Um, that's just kind of like like we're putting a values judgment on it. And that's not what behavioral ecologists are doing. They're just using the term to say that there's multiple different partners for both males and females. And probably the most extreme example of this is a mating strategy known as masting, wherein basically you just throw your gametes out into the ocean currents, and you hope that it runs into the gametes of another individual of your species, right? And there's reproductive time events that occur to synchronize that, but it's very common in sponges. Sponges and corals basically just throw their gametes up, and trees kind of do this too, when they just like mast pollen, right? So that's like the extreme example of promiscuity. It's also common in a group of organisms known as the bonobo chimpanzees, which is either a distinct species or a subspecies of chimpanzees, depending upon who you're talking to. And there's really interesting comparisons made between regular chimpanzees and bonobo chimpanzees. But one of them is that bonobo chimpanzees are incredibly promiscuous. They utilize sex to actually maintain social bonds, whereas other chimpanzees utilize grooming to maintain social bonding. And so basically what you have is males and females having sex with each other constantly, multiple times a day, all throughout the day. And it's not necessarily tied to reproduction. And there's a lot of interesting things. A lot of people have done like comparisons in behavior between bonobo chimpanzees and highland chimpanzees, particularly in terms of like bonobos don't really do warfare with other different clans, whereas highland chimpanzees do. And there's a lot of different interpretations to that, but it's really kind of an interesting example of promiscuity. There's other organisms that are promiscuous, but those I think, are the two most interesting ones to discuss. Sorry. So, in human cultures, we use the term polygamous and we usually mean one male and multiple females. But in terms of the animal kingdom, we don't use the term polygamous because we use the term polygyny or polyandry. Polygyny is one male and multiple females. The easiest example of this is lion prides. It's one male or two brothers will have control over the reproductive rights of an entire pride of female lions. This is also common in anomalous lizards, wherein about a third of the males acquire territory and they reproduce with all the females within that territory, but 2/3 of the males are excluded. So each male has about 2 or 3 females that they reproduce with. Polygyny is relatively common system across the animal kingdom. Polyandry is much less common, where there's multiple males to a single female. It's shown in Hymenoptera, where the queen will likely mate with multiple males throughout the course of her life. But it's generally, it's not the most common reproductive strategy. There's some other examples where it happens. Clownfish, I'm pretty sure, have this type of system as well. And I think there's some of the fishes, but it's not the most common system. Monogamy is a pretty common reproductive strategy, particularly amongst birds. Birds have a tendency to be monogamous. The degree of monogamy is variable, right? So there are some species that mate for their entire lives. They only have one partner their entire lives, and then but it's more common to have a serial monogamy situation. And serial monogamy is by far the most common situation humans observe. Something like 98% of reproductive pairings are serial monogamy pairings. And the basic idea behind serial monogamy is that this graphic at the left focuses on individual A, and individual A dates, 5 people throughout the course of that individual's life, but it never dates more than one at a time. Okay, so you're only with one person for a while, and then you might move on to someone else, or you might stay with them for the rest of your life. But that's the most common reproductive system seen out there, at least amongst humans. It's fairly pervasive amongst mammals, and it's very common amongst birds. Monogamy has a tendency to be very, very common when the cost of raising offspring is very high. So the higher the cost of the offspring, the more common monogamy becomes. And we'll talk about humans in a bit. The other thing to keep in mind about monogamy is there's some really interesting research on infidelity in monogamy. And it's really, really interesting to hear some of the theories about infidelity and why they exist. Unfortunately, a lot of them are just thought experiments because it's really hard to test these theories. But infidelity is definitely something that does occur in the animal kingdom, and it seems to be right around 20% of monogamous individuals will have done extramarital affairs, I guess is what you would say. All right. So when we talk about reproduction, we have a tendency to talk about resource allocation. Because raising offspring is expensive, right? And how much you invest in your offspring is a function of how much resources you have, and also what's going on in the ecosystem around you, right? So this resource allocation is basically what behavioral ecology is all about. So like I said earlier, when the cost of parental investment is high, it forces cooperation between the sexes. Parental investment in humans is extreme. And apparently the most recent data says that it costs over $200,000 to raise a child to adulthood. And that's not even talking about college, right? I just read somewhere that the cost of childcare is now the largest cost for people of reproductive age, which is fascinating, right? But even if you don't look at it in terms of dollars, the cost of parental investment in humans is pretty extreme. To raise a child to reproductive age, you have to spend 15 years of your life supporting them. And this isn't just a factor of modern society. This was true as well in Paleolithic people. And this is actually speculated to be one of the reasons why grandparent menopause existed, is because of how expensive it is to raise children. In terms of resource allocation, you needed extended family to be able to survive. 2 humans out there on their own was just never a situation that was viable in terms of human structure. And so we have to be pack animals to a certain degree. Because parental investment is so high, it changes the mathematics to a lot of the resource allocation that we're going to talk about. It's also important to consider when you talk about resource allocation, you're not just talking about parental care. You also have to consider the cost of the gametes. So male gametes are a dime a dozen, quite literally. The average amount of sperm in a single ejaculate is like 20 million or something like that. Whereas eggs, a female will only release about 100. No, it's like 400 eggs over the course of her lifetime. So in terms of like reproduction, eggs are much, much more expensive, right? They're 10 million times larger. So you have to keep that in mind, but it's also important to keep in mind the pre-mating, anything pre-mating that goes on. And as a general rule of thumb, males have a tendency to invest more heavily in pre-mating rituals, and females invest more heavily in gametes. And that can be viewed either in terms of conflict or it can be viewed in terms of cooperation, right? Like the male is trying to offset the female's loss of energy by providing her with food and shelter, right? So there's a couple different ways of looking at this, and there's some really interesting shit that we could get way in the weeds about, but I don't want to right now. So when you're talking about investment strategies, um, there's there's a lot of different conflict going on, right? So you can look what is the female's optimal strategy versus what the male's optimal strategy is, and a lot of it is dictated by prior investment, right? So the sex that invests more tends to be the one that provides the parental care. That tends to be the rule of thumb. More often than not, this is the female, right? So most commonly in mammals, this is the female. It's flipped in the fishes. The acquisition of a bedding site is actually really, really hard to find. And males compete quite heavily for those. So a male that has a really good egg laying spot will actually attract multiple different females. And because the investment in acquiring those is so high, the male has a tendency to take care of the offspring while the female just kind of runs away. So that's an interesting situation wherein the parental investment is actually flipped from what we think it is. There's also conflict going on between the parents and the offspring. From the offspring's point of view, they want to extract as much resources as they can from the parent, right? But the parents might want to invest more heavily into one of the other offspring, right? Like, particularly if you have a male versus a female, there's different pros and cons of males versus females offspring. Sometimes the male requires more resources, sometimes it's the female. It depends upon the specific species. And even in human cultures, the investment in males versus females has changed throughout history based on what's going on. So there's conflict between the parent and the offspring, and then the offsprings are also competing with each other for resources from the parents. So you can really break this all down into, like, where is the conflict and who is arguing for resources and what can be provided for resources. I want to point out, like I pointed out earlier, the cost of reproduction is so high in humans that parental investment is like you have to have two parents to raise an offspring successfully. This was probably always true. It's actually probably less true now than it ever was previously. If you just think about the history of human society, single mothers have not done well for themselves. So having two parents is is almost necessary in human society. The fields of sociobiology and behavioral ecology, which is where a lot of this literature comes from, is really ripe for criticism from a sexist point of view or from a feminist point of view. There's been a lot of really good critiques written on sociobiology and behavioral ecology. And I'm actually going to post a couple of those because it's really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is that a lot of this research was done by males, and they focused exclusively on the male point of view. And it only recently have people started to look at things from the female point of view, and they had a major blind spot. I mentioned earlier that female choice is something that really hasn't been investigated very heavily in the animal kingdom. It just seems like the literature when I was in graduate school basically said the females just kind of mate with whatever male is around. And I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if anyone's even tested that. So it's an area of research looking at female choice. Do female choose resources, and then the male who can acquire the most resources are the ones that are most successful, or are females picking where they spend their time based upon the males that are in the area, the number of males? And I honestly don't know. I would have to dig in the literature, but there's definitely a major blind spot. The other thing that you run across is the terminology in sociobiology and behavioral ecology becomes really, really, really problematic because it talks about resources. And so you get into situations where if the male is providing the female with like a food gift, you know, he's providing her with resources in exchange for reproductive access. And that doesn't really look good. The other thing that comes across is oftentimes mates will be described as resources as well. And so like that's definitely problematic. So I want to point out that there's a lot of like really problematic things going on in sociobiology. But a lot of the conclusions do explain why animals behave the way they do. The last thing I'd like to reiterate is that because of a wide variety of things, including culture and our own blind spot towards humans, a lot of the sociobiology and behavioral ecology stuff just doesn't really work with humans, or it doesn't really explain things very fully. So be very careful about applying anything sociobiology or behavioral ecology to humans. Oh yeah, and also we can't test on humans, so we can't really confirm if any of these theories work. So Trivers was a guy who spent a lot of time working on this, and he basically looked across the animal kingdom, and if I remember correctly, he specifically worked with lizards. So he worked with my study organism. And he found that male offspring tend to be riskier. And this is based upon the fact that there are some, with his organism, about a third of males acquired territories. The third that acquired territories had really, really high reproductive success. But the 2/3 who didn't acquire territories had really low reproductive success. So they were kind of a gamble, right? Like a third of your male offspring will acquire territory and be produce a lot of offspring for you. But 2/3 of them won't. Females, on the other hand, at least in his study species, seemed like most of them had some reproductive success, but it was lower than the superstar males, like those third of males who acquired territory. And he looked across the animal kingdom and he found out that this applied more broadly than just his study organism. And so he came up with the idea that males tend to be riskier and females tended to be more of a safe bet. So the idea is, if in good times, when you can invest a lot of resources into your offspring, it's good to have a male offspring, right? Because they may very well become one of those superstars and give you a lot of grandparent or grandchildren. But if times are bad and you can't invest a lot of resources, it's better to have a female offspring. And so then the question becomes, can animals actually skew their sex ratio? There's some evidence that they can. The book specifically mentions zoo studies that showed that in zoos they tend to produce more male offspring, and then also some correlational studies done in humans. But I want to circle back to some research I talked about earlier, which is my advisor, Matthew Laverne, and his postdoc advisor, Julie Wade, from 2001 to 2003. They basically showed that if you give lizards additional nutritional resources, they deposit more testosterone into their eggs, and they deposit more of other resources into the eggs. They basically produce bigger, stronger eggs, which makes a lot of sense. The other thing that's interesting is the deposition of more testosterone actually caused them to be more likely to produce male offspring. So there is some evidence that organisms can skew their sex ratio. So yeah, this is actually just the abstract from one of those two papers showing this. And if you're interested in this research, asked me about it. I forgot how cool this stuff was. Uh, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about mate selection because it's covered more in chapter 11, so we'll leave it towards then. I just want to point out that, reiterate that it's really interesting, but there's a lot of baggage in there, so we kind of need to be careful when we talk about it. It's interesting. We've talked previously about sexual dimorphism. It's interesting to point out that males and females have different characteristics. Sorry, I just wanted to get my notes up because I want to be able to talk about these different regions. A lot of the sexual dimorphism that you see is fairly obvious, like size differences, breasts, hips, stuff like that. There are some anatomical differences where, like, males have a more narrow pelvic girdle, females have a wider pelvic girdle, which has some interesting consequences in terms of locomotion. And just like the efficiency of locomotion in males is more efficient than in females. There's been a lot of research on the brain looking for sexually dimorphic regions, and we found some areas that are sexually dimorphic. The SDN-POA, sexually dimorphic nucleus of the medial preoptic area. It's larger in males than it is in females. This is thought to have something to do with male sexual behavior and controlling male sexual behavior, particularly like muscles associated with the penis. So there's not really anything too interesting there. The spinal nucleus of the bulbar cavernosus, that's actually a region that controls a muscle in the pelvic region. I can't remember if it's larger in males or females, but it's just one of the muscles. The muscles are larger in males or females. I can't remember which one it is. And whichever one has the larger muscle is the one that has the larger SNB. The most interesting one for me is the second one, the lateralization of the planum temporale. So lateralization is the idea that one side of your brain tends to control something, right? So the whole right brain, left brain thing isn't really, there's some truth to it, but like your brain is a mirror image of itself, and so you have two areas that are like used for controlling speech and language acquisition, stuff like that. But it tends to be that one side of your brain will be more active in controlling it than the other side of the brain. And the planum temporale is an area that is involved with speech, right? And it's highly lateralized. It's one of the most lateralized regions, right? But what's interesting is that it's less lateralized in females than it is in males, okay? So both sexes show lateralization, wherein one side is more developed than the other side of the brain, but females less so than males. The most interesting consequence of this is that if a man has a stroke in this area that controls speech, the other side of their brain isn't capable of picking up the slack. So men have a tendency to lose their ability to speak from a stroke more frequently just because they are more lateralized than females are. And in general, if you look at humans across the spectrum, females tend to have better grammar composition, word choice, higher vocabularies. Women are just better with speech than men as a sexual difference. So that was really interesting. There's the AVPV is the anterior ventral paraventricular nucleus, and that has that specifically releases hormones. GnRH is one of them, which kind of makes sense because women have monthly hormonal cycles, so there's just more going on there. The BNST is the bed nucleus of the striatum terminalis. For whatever reason, it's larger in males than it is in females, but we don't really know why, and we don't know what it does. And then the last one is the VIP-SCN, which is the vasoactive intensional polypeptide containing subnucleus of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Holy cow, that's a lot of words. It's larger in females, and it has something to do with circadian rhythm, but we really don't know. So it's really interesting that we've studied the brain and we've looked at differences in men and women, and we have noticed some differences between men and women in terms of their brain. But these differences account mostly for like differences in muscle regulation, in hormonal control of various different things. Definitely don't have anything to do with intelligence. There's been no study that has shown either males or females are more intelligent at anything. Males and females tend to have some different skills. Like I said previously, females tend to be better at communication. Men tend to be better at throwing things. But the overall differences are relatively minor. There's some interesting developmental differences between men and women, specifically that females undergo earlier puberty. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that. Or we already did talk about it. I can't remember which one it is. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but it is interesting that there's differences in puberty. One of the most interesting things is that survival differences. There's actually slightly more males born than females. It's like the ratio is like 1.05 males to females. But males have higher mortality at every single age group. And that's what that graph is showing right there. The blue is male deaths per 100,000, and the red is females. And you can see males die more frequently at every single age range, right? Particularly in that age range between, it looks like 15 to around about 30. And that's because young men are incredibly stupid in that they engage in highly risky behavior. They drive recklessly. They have a tendency to just like die from their own poor life choices. And females tend to be a little bit more cautious. You see a little bit of an uptick around that region, but it kind of levels out. But it's interesting because, so that would be, a lot of those would be extrinsic causes of death, but intrinsic causes of death are higher in men as well, and like hypertension is higher in men across the spectrum. So that's one thing that's super interesting. Menstruation is really interesting. There's something like 10 species. There's very few species that undergo menstruation. Most of them are primates. Sorry, my dog is going to start drinking again. There's a couple of, there's a couple of other animals. There's like a shrew that does it too, and then some other weird stuff. I'm not getting into too much details, but the vast majority of them are primates, right? And so, in most species, the endometrium only thickens if the embryo implants. But in humans, it thickens every month in anticipation of an embryo implanting. And then if an embryo doesn't implant, it sheds that endometrial lining. And so people are like, why? Why do humans have menstruation and other organisms don't? So it could be because we're a tropical species, or we evolved as a tropical species. And so the breeding season is all year long. So basically females always have to be ready to receive an offspring instead of having like one localized breeding season that occurs like one time out of the year. But if that's true, why don't we see other species why aren't there other mammals that undergo menstruation, particularly when there's a lot of mammals that are tropical species? So that doesn't really make sense. The next one is maternal-fetal conflict. So basically, if you look at resource allocation, the fetus wants to extract the maximum amount of nutrients out of the mother as she can. But the mother wants to limit those resources into like what she can actually afford to give the offspring and still give the offspring a good chance at survival. But if that's the case, and so like the endometrial lining, like the preparing for a zygote prior to implantation, could be like preventing like developing those resources and preventing the placenta from becoming like particularly ingrained into the uterus. But if that's true, then why not in other species? Like, why don't we see that in other species? Why don't we see that in elephants? Why don't we see it in white-tailed deer or whatever other mammal there is out there? And it is possible that the human placenta is particularly invasive. And there actually is some evidence that human placenta is slightly more invasive than some other closely related species, but not enough to fully explain it. The last theory or hypothesis that's most interesting is it could be a mechanism for early selection. It seems like there is selection going on like all the time in women. Like they are screening the eggs that they release for chromosomal abnormalities. So the book specifically mentions this research, Tecklenburg et al., 2010. And so what they did was they took some extra zygotes that were left over from IVF and they did some research on them. And they were exposed to endometrial stromal cells, which are basically, endometrial lining, right? And so they exposed these zygotes, and 75% of the zygotes entered an arrested state, and then they would have been just like sloughed off during the next menstrual cycle. And when they looked at the chromosomes of these 75%, the 75 that were in arrested state, there was a ton that had chromosomal abnormalities. So it could be possible that the stromal cells of the endometrium are actually like scanning the zygote prior to like during implantation and to make sure that it's viable before they invest resources into it. And it seems like in general, there's a lot of early selection going on in women. There's something like, well, okay, hold on, let me back up. So then you can ask the same question, why don't we see this in other organisms or other animals? And it turns out humans just have more frequent chromosomal abnormalities. It's just a product of our chromosomes and the structure of them. They seem to be not very stable. So screening for the high frequency of those abnormalities could be a reproductive advantage. Also, reproductive success is low. In general, a couple that is trying to conceive a baby will have about a 20% success rate any given month. So that's only a 1 in 5 chance. Whereas in a lot of other organisms, it's much higher than that. And why it is that way, I don't necessarily know. But it is also the point, like there is other evidence that females are selecting based on like chromosomal abnormalities and zygotes. It's estimated that 50% of pregnancies result in miscarriage, and something like 75 to 80% of those happen before the mother is even aware. Like it just becomes a normal period. So there's something to be said about that. So menstruation is also, well, and just like ovarian cycles in general, have clinical impacts. So it's estimated that Paleolithic women had about 100 to 150 cycles. So Paleolithic women, as I stated previously, had about seven births or 7 pregnancies, and about 3 to 5 of those would make it to adulthood. And so 7, if it takes about 3 years to wean a baby, you're pregnant for 9 months where you're not cycling, okay? And then when you're breastfeeding, you're much less likely to cycle. There's feedback that stops the reproductive cycling during breastfeeding, but some women will cycle during the breastfeed. So if you have 7 pregnancies over the course of 3 years of breastfeeding, you're talking about like 21 years where you're going to have reduced amounts of reproductive cycles. Why can't I think of the word? Menstrual cycles, that's the word. So Paleolithic women had significantly fewer reproductive cycles than modern women do. It's estimated that because of access to birth control, people are controlling how many children they have, and the amount of children that make it to adulthood is much higher. It's like 95 to 98% of children make it to adulthood. So the access to birth control has been really good in terms of like controlling family size, which has been a problem, but it's increased the number of menstrual cycles that a woman will have over the course of her life. And it's estimated that modern women will have 450 to 500 menstrual cycles. And like, it's important to keep in mind, like that is, that has a toll on the body as well, right? So increased exposure to estrogen and progesterone, not from the pill itself, but from just the regular monthly cycle. Estrogen is a growth factor, right? Like estrogen causes tissues to grow, and that could explain some of the increased rates of cancer seen in women, particularly breast cancer, ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, and stuff like that. So the fact that there are more reproductive cycles actually does have clinical consequences. And like think back to that graph I showed you guys on like the first or second class, where it showed differences in mortality between men and women, and like women had a much higher risk of cancer. So there is also evidence that selection is happening even prior to implantation. So women form millions of eggs, but they only release like 100 to 500 of them. And so there is evidence that women are selecting, they're not releasing the eggs that have problems with them. And there is some evidence that the uterus and the cervix specifically is selecting sperm. So sperm with low motility generally can't make it through the cervix. And also, sperm have different markers on them, like different glycoproteins and stuff like that. And the uterus there's some evidence that it's actually selecting what sperm it allows through and what sperm it targets for removal. So there is some evidence that women are selecting what sperm they allow to fertilize their eggs. Hold on, give me a second. Okay, so the placenta is it's the marker of placental mammals, right? So it's kind of a characteristic of mammals broadly now I think about it for a little bit. But it seems like it actually evolved a couple times because there are some fish that actually have placenta as well. But it's a very, very close interaction between the mother and the fetus. Um, and so the blood of the mother and the fetus never directly cross, but a lot of information will cross back and forth across it. Obviously, oxygen, nutrients, but like also antibodies and stuff like that will be passed back and forth. So even though the maternal and fetal blood never directly mix, they are sharing a lot of constituents of the blood, right? And so, yeah, cells can go back and forth across them. There's a general trend. The more K strategist a species is, the more invasive the placenta is. And as we've said, humans are very K strategists. So the human placental interaction is very, very close. There's some interesting stuff. So you may have heard about this before, but Rh factor is something that humans have. It's the plus or negative. If you're O positive, O negative, that's talking about the Rh factor. And not everybody has the Rh factor. Oh, let me make sure I get this right. So if an Rh positive, if an Rh negative mother has an Rh positive baby, right? The Rh negative mother will make antibodies to the Rh positive protein, okay? And that's usually not a problem for the first offspring, but for the second one, it can actually cause the Rh negative mother's antibodies to attack the fetus, and that can actually result in a miscarriage. Now, the interesting thing about that is, if that's the case, you would assume that the Rh factor would be selected against, right? But we don't see evidence of that, right? Like the Rh mutation occurred in, I think it was in somewhere in Europe, and it's actually kind of spread. So there must be some advantage to the Rh negative phenotype. And so I did a little bit of digging on this, and it actually turns out that there's a group of organisms called Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite, and we will talk more about Toxoplasma gondii because they're really freaking cool. But the Rh blood group, the polymorphisms of the Rh blood group actually provides some protection against Toxoplasma. And I linked the abstract there so you can read about it. This was super interesting for me. So preeclampsia is a situation where a woman develops high blood pressure during pregnancy. It can be very dangerous to both the mother and the fetus, okay? So I want to make sure I get this right. it affects between 5 and 10% of pregnancies. So the incidence decreases with repeated pregnancies from the same partner. So if a woman has multiple babies with the same partner, she's less likely to have preeclampsia in subsequent pregnancies. The interesting thing about this is men who've previously fathered preeclamptic babies are more likely to have another preeclamptic baby, even if it's a different woman they're having the baby with, right? So there's some contribution from the male that is causing this preeclampsia to occur. And it's also shown that if a woman has a baby, whatever her risk factor is for preeclampsia, say it's 5%, 10%, whatever it is, it goes down with each subsequent baby she has with the same partner. But if she has a new partner, it jumps back up to whatever her original baseline was. So a change in partner actually causes an increased risk for preeclampsia. And I have no explanation for why that happens. The book posits that that could be something that's reinforcing pair bonding in humans. I would need to see more evidence for that, but whatever. Pregnancy sickness. So it's really common for women to develop aversions to various different types of foods when they're pregnant, particularly compounds that are bitter. So like think coffee, and stuff like that, and different types of meat, stuff like that. And it's thought that this is actually an adaptive response because it stops the mother from eating things that are risky to the fetus, right? Because even if the mother, like we can ingest a certain amount of poisonous things and be just fine. Like coffee is kind of a poison, but I drank an entire pot of it this morning and I'll be just fine. But I'm a large male, right? So it's going to affect me very little. A fetus, on the other hand, will take that amount of, like the amount of coffee I drank this morning could have been lethal to a fetus, hypothetically. And so it's thought that the pregnancy sickness and the food aversions actually develop as an adaptive response to stop the mother from eating things that could potentially harm the fetus. Sorry, just looking through my notes. I need to look more into morning sickness and see if there's anything adaptive about that, but I'll get back to that. So regulation of fetal growth. There is some kind of, the mother limits how big the baby gets, right? I recently learned an interesting fact that there's a group of septuplets born in the 1970s, and they were averaging about like 1 or 2 pounds, which still means she had like 14, 15 pounds of baby. But with 7 offspring, like she couldn't have 7, 8 pound babies. Like that's just not going to work, right? And so it seems like there is a limitation in the amount of the size that a baby can get, and that's based upon the size of the mother. Larger mothers can give birth to larger babies, which is fairly intuitive. And part of this is regulated by the blood vessels that actually run to the uterus. And there's actually an interesting mechanism wherein the first baby is almost always the larger baby by about 150 grams. And this is because the uterine blood vessels haven't stretched out quite as much. And so that tends to restrict the size of the first baby, which from an evolutionary point of view makes sense because most complications occur with the first baby. So if it's a smaller baby, the mother's more likely to survive, right? A lot of the evidence for this is there was a guy who utilized artificial insemination to put Shetland ponies inside of Clydesdales, like Shetland pony Clydesdale offspring. And it was either a Shetland male and a Clydesdale female or the other way around. And they found out that the Shetland male the Clydesdale male into the Shetland female produced a larger baby, but not as much as the Shetland male into the Clydesdale female. So like the larger Clydesdale mother was able to produce a much larger baby than either one of the hybrids, right? Just because they have more blood flow going, so they can actually produce larger offspring. Humans have really, really big heads, and like that's a huge problem. Um, yeah, and there's selection upon how big a baby can get, and there's a really strong selective pressure on that, and we don't see that in chimpanzees. Chimpanzee birth tends to be much easier and much less risky to the chimpanzee than it does for human birth. The book has this quote, and I took it directly. Indeed, it has been suggested this led to a fitness advantage arising from living in a clan where the birth attendant was needed to deliver the fetus and clear the airway for the neonate. So it's arguing that complicated pregnancies actually became a selective advantage by selecting for group size, and I really think that is a horrible, horrible hypothesis, because the cost of complicated pregnancies would be much greater than any advantage you would get from living in a group. And there are other mechanisms to reinforce living in a group than complicated pregnancies. Okay, the book refers to menopause as the menopause, and I thought that was really interesting. Like, why put the in front of it? Why not just call it menopause? I wonder if the guy went to Ohio State or something like that. What we've been able to determine is it's something that only happens in humans. And so there's a lot of questions of why does this only happen in humans, right? One explanation is that our lives have been artificially increased in length, right? And human females just kind of run out of eggs to release. The evidence for this is that some chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans that are kept in zoos will actually go through menopause as well. And zoo animals have a tendency to live longer than their wild counterparts. I don't find this to be a particularly compelling explanation, just because I guess maybe it could be part of I think it makes sense a little bit. I was trying to think of like Paleolithic people, but even if you look at like Paleolithic versus chimpanzees, um, that's a pretty big difference. So it could have evolved in those 7 million years as an adaptive response, or like just a byproduct of having a longer life. And so releasing of the eggs stopped at a certain period of time, and there was no selective advantage to having children after a certain period of time. So yeah, sorry, I was just reading my notes really quick. The rest of the arguments are more adaptionist. So one is called the grandmother hypothesis. And so the basic idea is after a certain point of time, it's more adaptive for the female to help her children produce children than it is for her to produce children, right? Because the risk of dying in pregnancy past 40 is pretty high, exponential. So by foregoing reproductive success, she can increase her reproductive success by helping her daughter have kids or her son have kids. And so I can definitely see that. The other one is that it ensures that the youngest child makes it to adulthood. And so the basic idea behind this is, say a woman has 7 children, her oldest one is 21 and her youngest one is 1, right? If she dies in a childbirth when her youngest is 1 year old, then that 1 year old likely will not survive. And so by foregoing reproduction after her youngest child, it ensures that she'll stick around long enough for her youngest child to make it to adulthood. The last thing that I was considering is that it's just riskier to have pregnancies past a certain age. And so maybe by stopping pregnancies, or stopping the ability of pregnancies, it actually just increases survival overall. And at least there wouldn't be any selection against it. I don't think any of the adaptionist explanations are mutually exclusive. I think the grandmother hypothesis and the youngest child hypothesis could work in conjunction with each other. And then even considering, like, does the female just run out of eggs? While there probably has been selection for a longer life, there isn't a selection for producing more eggs at an old age because the risk of death is higher. And so, like, there's no adaptive reason to continue reproduction. So I think all of these together are a fairly adequate explanation for why menopause exists in humans. But I think you can consider them together, or at least I don't think they're competitively exclusive. Anyways, that's it.